What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. Andrew Carnegie's mega legacy. Stealing from the poor to give to the rich, Andrew Carnegie was one of the wealthiest men to have ever lived. He was born in Dunfermline, Scotland in 1835, the son of a handloom weaver. However, when the power loom began making handloom weavers redundant, his family moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1848. Carnegie had a keen eye for business, and his early investment in railway stocks proved fruitful. He made his millions as a steel magnate and became one of the richest men in America. He retired to a life of philanthropy in 1901 after selling his steel company for $250 million. Over the course of his life, Carnegie gave away over $350 million from his fortune. However, Carnegie was more than a philanthropic son of a weaver. He also got up to some dark things over the course of his life, namely, exploiting his workers to the point of abject destitution. The Tycoon rose to prominence during the Gilded Age, which Mark Twain characterized as a rotten era, in which the glistening appearance of gold obscured the real issues of the time. Carnegie's story inspired many people. A philanthropist and self-made millionaire who donated his wealth. For others, he was a robber baron who exploited his workers, broke their unions, and lived a storied life that he denied the people who worked on his behalf. Andrew Carnegie was a draft dodger who paid for a battle substitute. While the Civil War was raging, and the Union was desperate for able-bodied young men to help preserve the nation, Andrew Carnegie had different plans. The 28-year-old was already well on his way to becoming one of the wealthiest men in history when the draft came calling. So, rather than go into the military and do his duty, Carnegie paid $850, or $150,000 in modern money, for a substitute, an Irish immigrant, by capitalizing on the recently passed Conscription Act, which allowed for exemptions through the payment of a commutation fee. Quite literally, this meant that someone with less means stood in the millionaire's place on the battlefield, risking his life for the United States while Carnegie was safe and sound far from the fighting. He was a member of a hunting club that killed 2,029 people. Andrew Carnegie belonged to a Pennsylvania hunting club that was directly responsible for the deaths of 2,029 people. South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club was located upriver from the city of Johnston, Pennsylvania. Included on the club's property was a dam that was built to create a reservoir. The club had neglected the dam for a long time, and in 1889, after heavy rains, it broke. What followed was a 30-foot tall wall of water that rushed toward the unsuspecting people of Johnston. The flood swept through town, and there was so much water that it took a full 10 minutes for it to pass by. When it did, a fire broke out, killing an additional 80 people looking for shelter. Somehow, none of the super-wealthy members of the club were ever brought to justice for the deaths of thousands of people due to the neglect of their organization. He had a private army suppress the workers' rights movement. In 1892, Andrew Carnegie's steel plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania, was not doing so well. The Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel, and Tin Workers Union had formed. Henry Clay Frick, the company's chairman, announced that he would cut workers' wages by 22% to make more money for the company at the expense of its employees rather than allowing the union to exist. So, the union decided to go on strike. Carnegie thought it would be best to bring in mercenaries to break up the strike from his castle in Scotland. In the late 1800s, America's Pinkerton Detective Service was essentially a private army for the wealthy and powerful. Rather than accept strikes and labor rights claims, Carnegie delegated the task of undermining the rights of his workers to Frick, who brought in the Pinkertons to break strikes, enabling them to act as a mob to impose the will of the company on its workers. The Pinkertons attacked the striking workers but were soon overwhelmed when the entire town essentially came out to fight the strikebreakers. That wasn't before the private army killed 7 people. Eventually, the state militia was called in, and scabs were brought in to break the strike. Work continued at the plant over the 4 months of the strike, and eventually the union leaders were fired, blacklisted, and forced to take pay cuts and work more hours. He justified his low wages by saying workers would waste their money on food and drink and better clothing. Imagine that. In perhaps the most paternalistic line of reasoning that has ever been laid down, Carnegie once explained why he paid his workers the low wages that he did. On the one hand, the obvious reason was that low wages helped him keep his business competitive. On the other hand, there was his idea that if he paid his workers something resembling a living wage, they might use it on nice things. Consider that. He explained himself, reasoning. Trifling sums given to each every week or month would be frittered away, 9 times out of 10, in things which pertain to the body and not to the spirit, upon richer food and drink, better clothing, more extravagant living, which are beneficial neither to rich nor poor. Yes, it's likely that he didn't eat well or dress well. He had to look out for his spirit after all. Carnegie, like the majority of his fellow robber barons, became wealthy through numerous government aids and loopholes. The steel industry was where Andrew Carnegie made a fortune of many millions of dollars. While this may seem like the product of hard work and ingenuity, and no doubt he had no shortage of vision and belief to get all his wealth, Carnegie wasn't exactly the bootstrapping, totally self-reliant individual he would have had you believe him to be. In fact, Carnegie had a lot of help along the way, much of it from the U.S. government. For example, the Billionaire took advantage of the high tariffs that the United States instituted to protect the burgeoning domestic steel industry from cheaper steel products imported from overseas. This made competition more expensive in the steel industry, and helped ensure that prices would be high enough to make U.S. steel extremely profitable. Given his stance on unions and his incredibly unforgiving labor conditions for his workers, it's little wonder that the millions of dollars that Andrew Carnegie accumulated and then gave away were not simply looked upon as a good, benevolent thing. The Commission on Industrial Relations was established in 1915 by Congress and the executive branch. It asserted that foundations like Carnegie's were anti-democratic and powerful enough to undermine democracy. While the Carnegie mission of giving away his fortune seems noble, the underlying system that created his unbelievable wealth, such as poor education, poverty, and inequality, was a direct result of men like Carnegie exploiting the very people he sought to help. Carnegie was a pacifist, one who built warships. Andrew Carnegie was a well-known pacifist who said he wanted peace in the world. In 1907, he even helped build the Peace Palace for the World Court in The Hague, Netherlands, which was a place for international cooperation. The Billionaire tried unsuccessfully to put an end to World War I. That didn't stop Carnegie from entering the war profiteering market, however, given that he signed a contract to make steel armor for the Navy when his mother, the one who influenced his beliefs, died. It's possible that Carnegie was a pacifist after all. The steel he made for the Navy ended up being bad and didn't help the military. He tried to alter the dictionary to match his desired spellings. Spelling is hard, even for millionaire tycoons. There are rules about where I goes in relation to E and C, and all manner of irregular verbs, silent letters, and other conjugations. Carnegie tried to reform the dictionary by making words as easy to spell as possible because he didn't like all of this historically reasonable, naturally occurring, and culturally derived complexity. So, he founded the Simplified Spelling Board in 1906 to change English to one that had fully phonetic spellings so that it could become the global language. Linguistic imperialism, anyone. The Tycoon enlisted the help of President Teddy Roosevelt to get the changes made. Alas, Congress revolted, and the spellings of words remained the same. However, in the age of texting, it seems as if Carnegie may have gotten his wish in some respects. For example, he wanted a word like though to be spelled though, and now it sort of is. He gave away his wealth, but not in a way that actually helped the workers he had abused for a long time. Andrew Carnegie has often been praised as a generous man who used his wealth for philanthropic purposes, but the phrase robber baron isn't applied to him because of his generosity. Carnegie wrote essays called The Gospels of Wealth, in which he announced his plans to give away his fortune. The tycoon decided to give some of his wealth away at the end of his life, rather than starting by paying his employees more fairly or distributing his wealth in another way that was equally distributed. Not paying his workers adequately, cutting their wages at massive rates, and forcing them to work longer hours, changing the workday from 8 to 12 hours, are all forms of theft, and rather than giving his money away, Carnegie perhaps shouldn't have stolen in the first place. But, then again, that probably wouldn't have enabled him to showcase the same level of self-satisfaction that giving it away to his hand-picked choices did. However, we can give him credit for public libraries. The millionaire donated his wealth to the establishment of 1,689 public libraries in the United States. All told, he donated $60 million to build these institutions of learning. He got the idea when he was a boy working in a factory and couldn't afford the then exorbitant price of $2 for a membership at his local library. However, Carnegie didn't pay his workers a living wage to earn the money. In addition to the libraries, Carnegie established a technical school in 1900 that would eventually become one of the world's best universities. With a $1 million donation, he created a technical institute in Pittsburgh with the goal of providing an affordable education for working people. It expanded to include graduate programs and a sprawling Pittsburgh campus in less than 20 years, becoming Carnegie Tech. Carnegie Mellon was formed when the school and another college, the Mellon Institute, merged in 1967. One of the greatest philanthropists in American history, Andrew Carnegie has a paradoxical place in the country's economic and social legacy. He is credited with funding over 2,500 libraries, contributing to education, scientific research, and global peace initiatives, and his name is etched in the annals of wealth and giving. Yet behind the golden facade of generosity lies a far grimmer, grittier truth. Carnegie was also a man who amassed his wealth on the backs of the poor, ruthlessly exploited labor, and manipulated systems to benefit the rich at the expense of everyone else. Even though he gave away a lot of money, a lot of it came from suppressing the rights of working-class Americans, expanding his empire through loopholes and government protectionism, and making decisions that literally cost lives. As a result, his mega legacy is not just one of charity but also one of exploitation disguised as charity, a legacy that calls for a more in-depth and critical analysis. Carnegie's story is not a simple rags-to-riches tale of noble perseverance. It is a narrative drenched in contradictions, shaped by brutal capitalism, strategic cowardice, and a moral compass that often pointed wherever profit resided. Carnegie's humble beginnings, born to a handloom weaver in 1835 in Dunfermline, Scotland, are often used to frame him as the ideal self-made man. In 1848, the power loom made his father's job obsolete, so his family moved to the United States. Settling in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Carnegie quickly rose through the ranks of American industry, beginning in telegraphs and railroads and eventually entering the steel industry, where he would make his fortune. His timing and ambition were impeccable. As industrial America boomed, so did Carnegie's wealth. He had excellent business sense and made prudent investments in steel production and railroads at a time when America was undergoing massive infrastructure development. However, there was a much darker story behind Carnegie and his executive team's success, one in which workers toiled for long hours in perilous and hellish conditions for pathetic wages. The disparity between Carnegie's immense wealth and the suffering of his workers reflects the broader injustices of the Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain to describe an era of surface-level prosperity and underlying corruption and inequality. Indeed, for all the gold Carnegie distributed in later life, the core of his legacy remains deeply tainted by the means through which that wealth was acquired. Carnegie's conduct during the Civil War is an example of one of his most flagrant moral failings. Carnegie avoided military service by paying $850, an enormous sum at the time, for a substitute to take his place at the age of 28 and already well on his way to becoming one of the richest men in the country. The Conscription Act made it perfectly legal for wealthy men to avoid the draft by paying a commutation fee or hiring someone else to fight. The outcome: a poorer man, likely an Irish immigrant with few choices, went to war in his stead. This act of cowardice demonstrates the extent of economic inequality in 19th-century America, and how the powerful consistently manipulated systems to avoid the sacrifices expected of ordinary citizens. Carnegie was perfectly content to let someone with fewer options and less money risk their life while he remained safe and comfortable, an action that serves as a precursor to many of the decisions he would make later in life. Carnegie's negligence and elitism weren't just metaphorical, they were also deadly. The Johnstown flood of 1889 was one of his life's most damning events. Carnegie was a prominent member of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, a private, exclusive retreat for Pittsburgh's wealthy elite, situated above the town of Johnstown, Pennsylvania. The club owned a dam used to create a recreational lake. However, the dam had been neglected for a number of years. The club did nothing to fix it, despite warnings and obvious structural issues. When heavy rains came in May 1889, the dam collapsed, sending 20 million tons of water barreling down the valley. The resulting flood killed 2,209 people and destroyed entire communities. While this tragedy could be chalked up to an act of God, evidence clearly shows that the club, whose members included some of the richest and most powerful men in the country, bore substantial responsibility due to their neglect and corner-cutting. No one was ever held accountable, legally or financially. The victims' families were left to grieve and rebuild while Carnegie and his associates continued their lives of luxury. The Johnstown flood is a searing indictment of the privilege and impunity enjoyed by the elite, and a stark reminder that wealth often insulates individuals from the consequences of their actions. However, the 1892 Homestead Strike, a turning point in American labor history and a clear illustration of the brutality with which Carnegie and his executives responded to demands from workers, is perhaps the most infamous blemish on Carnegie's record. The Homestead Steel Works, located outside of Pittsburgh, had become a hub for organized labor. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers had successfully negotiated better wages and working conditions in the past. But Carnegie, ever the capitalist, wanted more profits and less union interference. Distancing himself from the brutality that would take place, he hired Henry Clay Frick, a well-known union buster, to do the dirty work while he was on vacation in Scotland. When the workers went on strike after wage cuts, Frick hired the notorious Pinkerton Detective Agency, a private army for the rich, to confront them. What ensued was an all-out battle. 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons were killed in a gunfight when the Pinkertons arrived on the mill by barge and tried to take it by force. Public sympathy initially sided with the workers, but the strike ultimately failed when the state militia intervened. Union leaders were blacklisted, wages were slashed, and working conditions deteriorated further. It is impossible to avoid Carnegie's role in the Homestead Massacre, even if it was indirect. He could have chosen to support the workers' right to organize or act as a mediator. Instead, he sanctioned a course of action that led to bloodshed and the destruction of organized labor in his empire. This hypocrisy is astonishing for a man who would later claim to care deeply about the well-being of others. Adding insult to injury, Carnegie once justified his decision to pay low wages by suggesting that if workers earned more, they would squander it on richer food and drink, better clothing, more extravagant living. This statement demonstrates a deeply condescending and paternalist attitude toward the working class. Carnegie, who lived in opulent mansions and traveled the world, believed that the poor should remain humble and spiritually focused. Never mind the physical toll of 12-hour shifts in steel mills, the injuries, the chronic illnesses, the poverty. He positioned himself as a steward of wealth, deciding how best it should be used, rather than allowing people to earn and control their own fates. A lot of the philanthropy of the Gilded Age was based on this ideology, which wanted to keep the poor dependent, humble, and grateful rather than empower them. The supposed rags to riches narrative also obscures the extensive advantages Carnegie received from the U.S. government. He benefited immensely from high tariffs that made foreign steel more expensive, giving domestic producers like him a clear competitive edge. Carnegie was happy to take advantage of protectionist policies when they served his interests, even though he preached the virtues of free enterprise and competition. The steel industry he dominated was heavily subsidized and protected by law, allowing him to build an empire not solely through genius and hard work, but through favorable legislation crafted to support industrialists. Carnegie's wealth was not a testament to pure capitalism but to crony capitalism, an economic system where government and big business collude to ensure the prosperity of the few at the expense of the many. This contradiction, between the myth of the self-made man and the reality of systemic advantage, continues to echo through today's economy. Carnegie's legacy is further complicated by the findings of the 1915 Commission on Industrial Relations, which examined the impact of massive private foundations like the Carnegie Corporation. Because they concentrated power in the hands of a few wealthy, unelected individuals, the commission came to the conclusion that such foundations posed a threat to democracy. While Carnegie gave millions to causes he thought were important, he also evaded democratic procedures. A small board of trustees, frequently selected from the same circles of wealth and privilege that supported the inequality on which his wealth was based, was held accountable for the institutions he established rather than the general public. A new aristocracy was established under this form of philanthrocapitalism, and it shaped public discourse, science, and education without public input. The very wealth that enabled Carnegie's donations was extracted from underpaid laborers, and the systems he funded with that wealth often entrenched the same inequalities they claimed to solve.